Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story about the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. You'll learn about history and get ready to drift off to sleep peacefully. First of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Imagine a world without nations, without the idea that the people of a country sharing a language and a history and a destiny have the right to govern themselves. Imagine a world without constitutions, without the notion that even kings must answer to the law. Imagine a world where your birth, the family you were born into, the estate you belonged, determined your entire life. Your taxes, your duties, your rights for the courts, your place in society. That was the world of Europe in 789. Within 25 years, it would be shattered beyond recognition. This the story of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps the most consequential quarter-century in the history of the modern world. It is a story of extraordinary ideas and extraordinary violence, of brilliant men and terrible events, of a civilization tearing itself apart and remaking itself in the image of its own most audacious dreams. It is a story whose echoes we still hear today, in the language of rights and citizenship, in the shape of our legal systems, in the very way we think about what a nation is and what a government owes its people. The story begins in France, the most powerful and the most restless kingdom in Europe. It begins with a world that was, in many ways, magnificent, and with a world that was, in many ways, profoundly wrong. Part I. The Old World and En 7 Monsem en 788, the Ansilegium, on the Suicides of Revolution on the Mail of the 18th century. France stood as the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Its capital Paris was a city of breathtaking grandeur, wide boulevards lined with torchlight, magnificent churches rising above the rooftops, and a royal court at Versailles that set the standard for all civilized society. To the outside world, France was the pinnacle of European civilization. But beneath that glittering surface, the foundations of the old world were beginning to crack. The society of 18th century France was built on a system that had been in place for centuries, a rigid hierarchy known as the Ancien Regime, or the Old Regime. At its top sat the king, Louis XVI, who ruled by divine right, answering to no one but. Below him came the First Estate, the clergy, who controlled vast tracts of land and collected tithes from the population. Below them came the Second Estate, the nobility, who enjoyed extraordinary privileges and paid almost no taxes. And at the very bottom, making up 97% of the French population, came the Third Estate, commoners of every kind, from wealthy merchants to starving peasants, who bore the overwhelming burden of taxation and received almost nothing in return. This structure had functioned, however imperfectly, for generations. But by the 1750s, cracks were forming that would prove impossible to repair. The first crack was intellectual. Across Europe, a movement known as the Enlightenment was reshaping how educated men and women thought about government, society, and human rights. Philosophers like Voltaire mocked the church's authority with devastating wit. Montesquieu argued that governments should be built on the separation of powers, drawing lessons from ancient Rome and modern England. Jean-Jacques Rousseau of a social contract. The idea that legitimate government derived not from divine blessing, but from the consent of the governed. These ideas circulated widely, printed in pamphlets and encyclopedias, debated in salons and coffeehouses. They gave people a language to describe their grievances and, more dangerously, a vision of what an alternative might look like. The second crack was financial. France had bankrupted itself fighting wars. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763 on nearly every continent, had drained the treasury. The American Revolutionary War, in which France had invested heavily to humiliate its great rival Britain, had drained it further still. By the 1780s, France was spending more than half its annual revenue simply servicing its national debt. The government was essentially insolvent, and every minister of finance who tried to implement meaningful reform found himself blocked by the nobility and the church, who refused to surrender their tax exemptions. The third crack was agricultural, a series of poor harvests through the Viventine Age, culminating in the catastrophic winter of 1788, left millions of French peasants without enough bread to eat. In a society where bread was the primary food source for most of the population, this was not a mere inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death. Hungry people are desperate people, and desperate people are dangerous. The price of bread soared. Wages stagnated, and everywhere, from the countryside to the slums of Paris, ordinary French men and women seethed with a quiet, building fury. Louis XVI, the man at the center of all this, was not a villain. He was, by most accounts, a decent and well-meaning man, intelligent enough in some respects, genuinely interested in science and geography to his family. But he was catastrophically unsuited to the moment in which history had placed him. He was indecisive, easily influenced by those around him, and constitutionally unable to take the bold, decisive action that the crisis demanded. His wife, the Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette, was brilliant and charming, but her extravagance and her foreign birth made her a lightning rod for public resentment. The French called her Madame Deficit, and though the stories of her indifference to the poor were often exaggerated or invented, the image stuck. By 1788, France stood at a crossroads. The treasury was empty. The harvests had failed. The cities were full of hungry, angry people who had been reading Enlightenment philosophy for a generation and were beginning to ask questions that the ancien régime had no good answers to. King Louis, desperate for revenue and unable to bypass the nobility without broader political support, took an extraordinary step. He summoned the Estates General, a representative body that had not met since 1614, to assemble the following year. It was an admission that something had to change, but neither the king nor anyone else could have imagined how completely or how violently that change was about to arrive. Part 2. The breaking point, 1789. From the Estates General to the fall of the Bastille, the Estates General convened at Versailles on the 5th of May, 789. Representatives of all three estates had traveled to the palace from across France, many of them carrying with them documents, called cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances, in which ordinary French citizens had written down everything they wanted the king to know about their hardships. The sheer volume of these documents was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of complaints about taxes, about noble privileges, about corrupt officials, about the price of bread. It was, in a sense, the most extensive public consultation in French history, and it revealed the depth and breadth of popular discontent. Almost immediately, the meeting ran into a fundamental dispute about procedure. The question seemed technical: how should votes be counted? But its implications were revolutionary. Traditionally, each estate voted as a block. One vote for the clergy, one vote for the nobility, one vote for the commoners. This meant that the first and second states, represent about 3% of the population, could always outvote the third estate, which represented the other 97%. The third estate refused to accept this arrangement. They demanded that votes be counted by head, not by estate, a change that would give the commoners a genuine voice in the proceedings. When Louis refused to yield on this question, the representatives of the third estate made a bold and historic decision. On the 17th of June, 1789, they declared themselves to be a national assembly, not representatives of a particular state, but representatives of the French nation as a whole. It was, in its way, a revolutionary act, and a sovereignty resided not in the king but in the people. Louis responded by locking them out of their meeting hall. Undeterred, the delegates moved to a nearby tennis court, where they took the famous tennis court oath, swearing that they would remain assembled until they had given France a new constitution. Some members of the clergy and even a few liberal nobles joined them. Louis, advised by more conservative courtiers, began moving troops toward Versailles and Paris. The population of Paris, already hungry, already angry, interpreted this as preparation for a royal crackdown. Rumors spread through the city that the king was about to dissolve the National Assembly by force. On the 12th of July, the king fired his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, who had been seen as a friend of reform. The news hit Paris like a thunderclap. That evening, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a café table in the Palais Royal and called the people to arms. On the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd of several hundred Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and state prison that loomed over the eastern neighborhoods of the city as a symbol of royal tyranny. In fact, it held only 7 prisoners at the time, and its military significance was minimal. But as a symbol, it was everything. The Bastille represented the arbitrary power of the crown, the power to imprison without trial, without charge, without appeal. When the crowd tore it down, stone by stone, they were not simply attacking a building. They were attacking a system. The fall of the Bastille sent shockwaves through France. In the countryside, peasants rose up against their landlords in a wave of violence and fear known as the Great Fear. Chateaux were burned, tax records destroyed, noble privileges abolished by force where they had not been surrendered voluntarily. On the 4th of August, 789, in a single extraordinary night of aristocratic renunciation, noble after noble rose in the National Assembly to surrender their feudal rights. By morning, the legal structure of the ancient regime had effectively been dismantled. The old France was gone. On the 26th of August, the National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, of the Citizen, one of the most important documents in the history of democracy. It declared that all men were born free and equal in rights, that liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression were natural rights, that sovereignty resided in the nation, and that the law must be the same for all. It was a statement of principles as much as a legal document, and its influence would echo through the centuries, inspiring revolutions and reform movements on every continent. But the revolution was not yet secure. In October, with bread still scarce and Louis still hesitating to endorse the new order, a crowd of several thousand women, fishwives, market vendors, working-class Parisians, marched 12 miles from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain, armed with pikes and kitchen knives. They forced their way into the palace, killed 2 of the royal guards, and demanded that the king return to Paris, where the people could keep an eye on him. Louis had no choice. The royal family made the long, humiliating journey back to the capital, followed by an enormous crowd. The king was now, in effect, prisoner of his own people. Part 3. The Constitutional Experiment. 1789-1789. Building a new France on uncertain ground. For the next 2 years, France attempted something that had never quite tried before. The orderly reconstruction of an entire political system while that system was still running. The National Assembly, soon renamed the National Constituent Assembly, transformed France from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy, drafting laws, reorganizing the church, restructuring the courts, and laying the foundations of a modern state. The reforms were sweeping. France was reorganized into 83 administrative departments, replacing the patchwork of provinces, counties, and feudal territories that had existed before. A new judicial system was established with elected judges and clear procedures. Feudalism was formally abolished. The guilds that had controlled economic life in the cities were dismantled. The metric system was introduced, and the vast properties of the Catholic Church, perhaps 10% of all land in France, were nationalized and sold off to pay the government's debts. This last measure, the confiscation of church property, was particularly consequential. To raise money quickly, the government issued paper currency backed by the value of these lands, called assignats. At first, this worked, but as the government printed more and more assignats to cover its expenses, their value began to fall. An early lesson in the dangers of paper money, without adequate backing. Inflation became an increasingly serious problem in the years that followed. The relationship between the Revolution and the Catholic Church was one of the most divisive issues of the period. In 1790, the National Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which effectively nationalized the French Church and required priests to swear loyalty to the state rather than to the Pope. This was a step too far for many deeply Catholic French people, particularly in rural areas. The Pope condemned the measure. Priests who refused to take the oath, the non-jurors as they were called, became the focus of fierce local conflicts. The religious question would divide France for years to come. Meanwhile, the political culture of the Revolution was evolving in ways that would prove enormously consequential. Political clubs, organizations where citizens could debate the issues of the day, sprang up across France. The most influential was the Jacobin Club, formerly known as the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, which began as a moderate reformist organization, but would become increasingly radical as the revolution intensified. The Cordeliers Club attracted more populist voices. Women formed their own organizations, like the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, though their formal participation in political life remained circumscribed. The political vocabulary of left and right, so fundamental to modern politics, dates from this period. In the National Assembly, deputies supported the king's veto power sat to the president's right. Those who opposed it sat to his left. From this simple seating arrangement grew an entire framework of political orientation that the world still uses today. King Louis, meanwhile, was caught in an impassable position. He had formally accepted the new constitutional order, but privately he loathed it. He was the devout Catholic who found the civil constitution of the clergy deeply offensive. He resented his confinement in Paris, and he was surrounded by émigrés nobles, aristocrats who had fled France after 1789 and were now urging crowns for Europe. Europe intervened militarily to restore the old order. In June 791, Louis made a fateful decision. He and his family disguised themselves as servants and attempted to flee France, hoping to reach the border and join the forces gathering against the revolution. The flight was a disaster. At the small town of Valence, near the northeastern border, the royal family was recognized and arrested. They were escorted back to Paris in humiliating fashion, surrounded by crowds who were furious at what they saw as treason. The flight to Valence destroyed whatever remained of Louis' credibility as a constitutional monarch. If he had been willing to flee to the enemies of France, could he really be trusted to govern in France faithfully? The Republicans, those who wanted to abolish the monarchy entirely, it gained enormous strength from the episode. In April 792, the new Legislative Assembly, which had replaced the Constituent Assembly, declared war on Austria, whose emperor was Louis's brother-in-law, and declared enemy of the revolution. It was a decision that would transform everything. The Revolutionary Wars, which would eventually engulf nearly all of Europe, had begun. France faced its enemies from a position of profound weakness. Its army was in chaos. Its officer corps had been decimated by immigration. Its finances were desperate. The early months of the war were catastrophic. Austrian and Prussian army poured across the border. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Allied forces, issued a manifesto threatening Paris with military execution if any harm came to the royal family. In Paris, the response was volcanic. On 10th of August, 792, a massive uprising, coordinated radical sections of the city, stormed the Tuileries Palace where the royal family was living. The Swiss guards who defended the palace were massacred. The Legislative Assembly, under enormous pressure, suspended him from his functions and ordered his imprisonment. The monarchy, in practical terms, was over. A new body, the National Convention, was to be elected to draft a new Republican Constitution. Part EV, the Republic and the Terror, 1792 to 7794. When revolution devoured its own children in September on 1792, as Prussian armies advanced toward Paris, a wave of violence swept through the city's prisons. Mobs broke into the jails and massacred between 1,000 and 15 printed prisoners, mostly common criminals, priests who had refused the loyalty oath, but also some political prisoners. The September massacres, as they became known, horrified many observers within France and across Europe. They were a sign of how the revolution was changing, how fear and paranoia were beginning to corrode the idealism that had inspired the original uprising. The National Convention met for the first time on the 21st of September 1992, and its first act was to abolish the monarchy and proclaim France a republic. It was a decisive moment. France was now officially a republic, the first major republic in Europe since the ancient world. The convention adopted a new calendar, with the year numbered from the founding of the republic rather than the birth of Christ. A revolutionary assertion that history itself was beginning anew. The trial of Louis XVI dominated the winter of 1992. The debate in the convention was fierce. Could a king be tried? If so, could he be condemned to death? Were there practical reasons to spare him? Diplomatic considerations? The risk of making him a martyr? In the end, the convention voted by a margin of 361 to 360, a margin of a single vote, to send Louis to the guillotine. On the 21st of January, 793, Louis XVI was executed on the Place de la Révolution in Paris. He died with dignity, attempting to speak to the crowd before the drumroll drowned him out. His death shocked Europe. The war expanded. Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands joined the coalition against France. France, in 1793, was besieged on every side. Foreign armies pressed in from the north, east, and south. In the Vendée region of western France, a massive counter-revolutionary uprising, rooted in religious devotion and resentment of conscription, threatened to tear the country apart from within. In Lyon, Marseille, and other major cities, moderate Republicans had taken control and were resisting the authority of the Paris-dominated convention. The Republic seemed to be on the verge of collapse. It was in this context of genuine emergency that the most radical phase of the revolution, the Terror, took shape. In the 793, a small committee of 12 men, known as the Committee of Public Safety, took effective control of the French government. Its dominant figure was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras who had been an early and consistent champion of democratic principles, and who had earned the nickname the Incorruptible for his apparent immunity to bribery and personal corruption. Robespierre was a man of fierce convictions and cold logic. He believed sincerely and deeply that the revolution was engaged in a struggle for survival against enemies, both external and internal, and that extraordinary measures were justified by the extraordinary circumstances. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, gave the revolutionary tribunals sweeping powers to arrest and try anyone deemed an enemy of the Republic. The definition of suspect was extraordinarily broad: anyone who had expressed sympathy for tyranny, anyone who actively supported the revolution, anyone who could not account for their means of living. Denunciations multiplied, the prisons filled, and the guillotine, that efficient machine of a revolutionary justice, worked without stopping. The numbers are still debated by historians, but the broad picture is clear. During the period known as the Terror, roughly 17,000 people were officially executed by the revolutionary tribunals, and perhaps 40,000 more died in prison or were killed in the bloody suppression of the Vendée uprising and other regional revolts. The victims included not only aristocrats and priests, but also many revolutionary figures who were judged insufficiently committed to the cause. Georges Danton, one of the most powerful politicians of the early revolution, went to the guillotine in April 1790, supposedly because he had argued for relaxing the terror. His last words as the blade descended were reportedly, "Above all, don't forget to show my head to the people, it's well worth seeing." The journalist Jacques-Louis David choreographed spectacular festivals of republican virtue. The cult of the Supreme Being, a deist civil religion intended to replace Catholicism, was inaugurated with an elaborate ceremony in June Saint-End, 9th day 4, at which Robespierre presided, wearing a sky blue coat and carrying a bouquet of flowers. But by this point, many in the convention feared that Robespierre's definition of virtue was elastic enough to include anyone he found inconvenient. The terror was no longer just targeting enemies of the revolution. It was devouring the revolution itself. On the 9th of Thermidor, which is to say the 27th of July, 1494, in the old calendar, a coalition of convention members who feared for their own lives struck first. Robespierre was arrested during a session of the convention, shouted down by men who had once been his allies. The following day, he went to the guillotine along with his closest associates. The terror was over. The period that followed was known as the Thermidorian reaction, a deliberate turning away from the radical policies of the Committee of Public Safety towards something more moderate, more comfortable for the wealthy bourgeoisie who had benefited most from the early revolution. The legacy of the terror is one of the most contested questions in the history of the French Revolution. Was it a necessary response to a genuine emergency? A republic fighting for its life against foreign invasion and internal rebellion, or was it a descent into tyranny that betrayed the very principles it claimed to defend? Historiated both sides of this question with great passion and great evidence. What is undeniable is that the terror left deep scars on French political culture, a memory of how quickly revolutionary idealism could curdle into systematic violence that would shape French politics for generations to come. Part V. The Directory and the Rise of Napoleon, 1795 to Vern 5 to 799. From Thermidor to Brumaire, the Thermidorian reaction did not bring stability, brought a different kind of chaos. The men who came to power after Robespierre's fall were, by and large, men who had survived the terror by being flexible enough to denounce their former allies when the wind changed. Men who were, therefore, not entirely trusted by anyone. The new constitution of 1795 created a government called the Directory, led by 5 executive directors and supported by 2 legislative chambers. It was designed with elaborate checks and balances, prevent any single person or faction from gaining too much power. In practice, it created a government that was perpetually gridlocked and perpetually corrupt. The Directory faced problems on every side. The assignat currency had collapsed, triggering a financial crisis. Food remained scarce and expensive. Radical Jacobins on the left mounted a conspiracy. The Conspiracy of Equals, led by Gracchus Babeuf, that was suppressed in Saint-Étienne in 1996, but pointed toward dangerous social tensions. On the right, royalists who hoped to restore the monarchy gained strength with each passing election. When elections produced too many royalists, the Directory annulled the results, a practice that gave the government an air of illegitimacy that never quite went away. France was still at war, but the nature of the war was changing. After the early disasters of 1992, 7th and 9th Three said revolutionary armies, their OVs, their officer curves to aristocrats and refilled with talented commoners promoted on merit. Their ranks swelled by the Livian mess that had mobilized the entire nation, had fought their way back from the brink. By 1794 and 14 and 1795, France had not only repelled the foreign invasion, but had taken the offensive, pushing into the Austrian Netherlands and the German states. A series of remarkable young generals had emerged from the chaos. The most remarkable of them was Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in Corsica in 7769, the year after France acquired the island from Genoa, Napoleon was technically French, but culturally Corsican. An outsider who had attended the French military academy on a scholarship and graduated with a fierce ambition to prove himself. He was short, intense, and possessed of an extraordinary military mind. His first moment of national prominence came in 795, when he used artillery to disperse a royalist uprising in Paris. The famous whiff of grape shot that saved the Directory from overthrow. The directors noticed him and gave him command of the army of Bonaparte, which Wien did in Italy between 796 and 1797 was nothing short of astonishing. With an army that was underfed, undersupplied, and outnumbered, he launched a campaign of breathtaking speed and audacity, winning battle after battle against the Austrians and their allies. He moved his forces with a rapidity that bewildered opponents trained in the slow, methodical warfare of the 18th century. He motivated his troops with direct personal appeals and the promise of glory and plunder. Within a year, he had conquered most of northern Italy and forced Austria to sue for peace. France gained Belgium, the left bank of the Rhine, and influence over a new set of Italian republic. Napoleon returned to France a hero. He was 28 years old. The Directory, simultaneously grateful for his victories and nervous about his popularity, sent him east to Egypt, of all places. The Egyptian campaign of 98 to 1798 was conceived partly as a blow against British commercial interests, and partly as a way to keep Napoleon occupied at a safe distance. He brought with him not only an army, but a commission of scientists and scholars, whose work would eventually produce the encyclopedic description of Egypt and establish the field of Egyptology. He also brought the printing press, which he used to wage a sophisticated propaganda campaign. The Egyptian adventure was, in military terms, a mixed. Napoleon's army won spectacular victories on land, most notably the Battle of the Pyramids, where he is said to have told his troops that 40 centuries of history were watching them from above. But the British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, cutting Napoleon's army off from France and stranding it in a hostile desert. Napoleon led an expedition into Palestine, but was turned back at the Siege of Acre. When news reached him that France was in political crisis, that a new coalition of European powers was winning battles on multiple fronts, he made a characteristically audacious decision. He abandoned his army, slipped through the British naval blockade, and sailed back to France. By the time Napoleon arrived in France in 1799, the Directory was deeply unpopular and clearly failing. The political moment was perfect for someone with Napoleon's combination of military prestige and political ambition. Working with co-conspirators including his brother Lucien, the Abbé Sieyès, and the director Talleyrand, Napoleon orchestrated a coup d'état on the 18th of Brumaire, the 9th of November 1799, in the old calendar. The Directory was dissolved. A new governing structure, the Consulate, was established with Napoleon as first consul. In theory, he shared power with two other consuls. Practice, he was the unquestioned leader of France. The revolution, in the sense of active political upheaval, was effectively over. What came next was something different. The institutionalization of some revolutionary gains, the reversal of others, and the projection of French power across Europe on a scale that would reshape the continent for a generation. Napoleon understood, at least in the beginning, that his power rested on popular legitimacy as much as on military force. He positioned himself not as a conqueror of the revolution, but as its consolidator, the man who had saved France from both the excesses of the Terror and the incompetence of the Directory, and who would preserve what was best about 1789 while restoring order and prosperity. Part Z's. Napoleon as consul and emperor, then 799 to 1899 Tiro Fervent, the architect of a new Europe. First years of the Napoleonic rule were among the most productive and consequential in French history. He moved with extraordinary speed and energy, imposing order on the chaos that the revolution had left in its wake and building institutions that France and much of Europe would use for centuries. Napoleon was not simply a military genius, he was also a legislative one. He understood that durable power required not just conquest but administration. In 1800, Napoleon reorganized the French administrative system, establishing the prefect system, centrally appointed officials who would govern each department with direct authority from Paris. It was efficient, uniform, and deeply effective. The same principle applied to the legal system. Napoleon brought together a team of brilliant legal scholars and set them to work creating a unified code of laws for France. The Civil Code, promulgated in 1804 and soon known simply as the Napoleonic Code. It remains, in modified form, the basis of the legal systems of France, dozens of other countries around the world today. The Code was a monument to Enlightenment principles: equality before the law, freedom of religion, security of property, the abolition of feudal distinctions. But it also reflected Napoleon's own social conservatism in certain areas, particularly regarding women and the family. Married women were placed under the legal authority of their husbands, with limited rights to own property or enter contracts. The gains that women had made during the more radical phases of the revolution were, in many respects, rolled back. Napoleon famously believed that women's primary role was as wives and mothers, and the code reflected that belief. Napoleon also resolved the bitter conflict with the Catholic Church that had begun with the civil constitution of the clergy. In 1801, he negotiated a concordat with Pope Passatsi, acknowledging Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French people and restoring the Church's public role, while maintaining the state's authority over clerical appointments and refusing to return the church property that had been sold during the Revolution. It was a characteristically pragmatic compromise. Napoleon himself was not devout. He seems to have regarded religion primarily as a social tool. But he understood that alienating France's Catholic majority was politically foolish. In 1802, a national plebiscite, the first of several that Napoleon would use to legitimize his authority, approved him as consul for life. 2 years later, in a ceremony of breathtaking grandeur in Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon crowned Emperor of the French, taking the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VI and placing it on his own head. A deliberate gesture asserting that his power came not from the Church, but from himself, from France, from history. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor Francis the War responded by dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in various forms since Charlemagne's coronation in 800 AD. A structure that had defined European politics for 1,000 years was gone. The wars, meanwhile, had continued and intensified. Napoleon's enemies were persistent. Britain, in particular, was relentless. It could not invade France, but its wealth-funded coalition after coalition against Napoleon, and its navy made the seas impossible for French ships. Napoleon's response was twofold. On land, he would defeat his continental enemies decisively. At sea, he would strangle Britain economically through a blockade of European ports. The land victories were spectacular. In December 8805, at Austerlitz in Moravia, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia in what many military historians consider the most perfectly executed battle in history. His plan was brilliant in its audacity. He deliberately weakened his own right flank to invite the enemy to attack it, then struck the enemy's center with overwhelming force while it was overstretched. The Allied army was destroyed. Austria was forced from the war on humiliating terms. Russia retreated east. Napoleon reorganized Germany, dissolving the old structures and creating the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under French protection. In October 1806, Prussia rashly declared war. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day, Napoleon and his generals shattered the Prussian army, the army of Frederick the Great, which had been considered one of the finest in Europe. In a matter of hours, Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph. In June 1807, he defeated Russia again at the Battle of Friedland, forcing Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit and carved up Europe between them. France was at the height of its power. Napoleon controlled, directly or through client states and allies, virtually the entire continent from Portugal to Poland. But even at this moment of supreme triumph, the seeds of Napoleon's eventual downfall were being planted. Britain remained unconquered and unconquerable, its navy dominant after Nelson's great victory at Trafalgar in October 1805, where a British fleet under the dying admiral had destroyed a combined French and Spanish fleet and secured British supremacy at sea for the rest of the century. And in Spain, a particular kind of trouble was brewing, the kind that no amount of military genius could easily solve. Parts vivi. The Spanish ulcer and the Russian catastrophe, 1808, T812. The limits of Empire Spain was France's ally in the early years of the Napoleonic period, but by 1808, Napoleon had grown impatient with the weakness and instability of the Spanish monarchy. In a series of moves that combined bullying, manipulation, and outright treachery, he forced the Spanish royal family to abdicate and placed his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Spanish people did not accept this. They rose in a nationwide insurgency, one of the first and most brutal guerrilla wars of the modern era. The word guerrilla itself, meaning little war, comes from this conflict. Spanish irregular fighters harassed French supply lines, ambushed patrols, killed collaborators, and melted back into the civilian population before the French could retaliate. French soldiers responded with reprisals that only deepened the population's hatred. Francisco Goya captured the horror of this conflict in his Disasters of War series. Images of mass executions, mutilated bodies, and human suffering that remain among the most powerful anti-war images ever created. Into this morass stepped the British. The Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, one of history's great generals, landed in Portugal in 1808 and began the long Peninsular War campaign that would tie down hundreds of thousands of French troops for the next 6 years. Wellington was a methodical, cautious commander who understood that his relatively small British army was a resource he could not afford to squander. He fought on terrain of his own choosing, used fortification and supply with masterful efficiency, and consistently avoided the pitched battles in which French commanders excelled. The war in Spain was a bleeding wound that Napoleon could never stanch, a Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon himself reportedly called it, that continuously drained French strength and resources. Meanwhile, Napoleon's continental system, his attempt to strangle Britain economically by forbidding European ports from trading with the British, was causing serious problems throughout his empire. The system hurt continental economies as much as it hurt Britain, cutting off access to British manufactured goods and colonial products. Countries that nominally accepted the system routinely found ways to evade it. Smuggling became a major industry across Europe. Even Napoleon's own allies were reluctant to enforce the blockade strictly, because doing so damaged their own economies. In particular was suffering under the continental system, and Tsar Alexander I was growing increasingly restless under what he regarded as French domination. Russian nobles resented being cut off from the British trade that brought them income. Russian nationalists chafed at the humiliation of Tilsit. And Alexander had his own ambitions in Europe that conflicted with Napoleon's. By 1811, it was clear that the alliance was breaking down. Both sides began preparing for war. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in 1812 was, with the benefit of hindsight, the defining catastrophe of his career. He assembled the Grand Army, the largest army Europe had ever seen, more than 600,000 men drawn from across the French Empire and its subject states. Crossed the Russian frontier in June 1812. His plan was to force a decisive battle quickly, defeat the Russian army, and compel Alexander to negotiate. It was the strategy that had worked everywhere else in Europe. But Russia was not like everywhere else. The Russians refused to give Napoleon the decisive battle he sought. Instead, they retreated, drawing the French deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior, burning crops and supplies as they went to deny resources to the invaders. The French advance was agonizing. The heat of summer gave way to rain and mud, then to the first cold winds of autumn. Soldiers fell not primarily to enemy bullets, but to dysentery, typhus, exhaustion, and hunger. At Borodino on the 7th of September, 80 miles west of Moscow, the Russians finally turned to fight. The battle was one of the bloodiest in history. Perhaps 70,000 casualties on both sides in a single day. Napoleon won the field, but failed to achieve the decisive destruction of the Russian army that he needed. The Russians retreated in good order, and when Napoleon entered Moscow a week later, he found the city largely empty. The population had fled, and shortly afterward, great fires broke out that burned most of the city to ashes. Whether the fires were set deliberately by the Russians or were the result of looting and accident remains debated. What is not debated is that Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow for 5 weeks, hoping Alexander would negotiate, and no message came. In mid-October, with winter approaching and no prospect of peace, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was one of the most terrible military disasters in history. The Grand Army had entered Russia with more than 600,000 men. It emerged at the end of 1812, perhaps 100,000. And many of those were broken, frostbitten, and barely alive. The rest had died of cold, hunger, disease, or enemy action. The roads out of Russia were littered with the frozen corpses of men and horses for hundreds of miles. Europe took note. The myth of French invincibility was shattered. The Grand Army had been destroyed not by a superior enemy on the battlefield, but by the impossible distances and brutal winter of Russia. For the first time since Austerlitz, the defeated nations of Europe dared to believe that Napoleon could be beaten. Part B. The coalition and Napoleon's fall, 1810 to 1815. From Leipzig to Waterloo, Napoleon was not finished. With extraordinary energy and organizational ability, he rebuilt his armies through the winter of 1812 to 1813. But the pool of experienced manpower was running dry. The new conscripts were younger and less seasoned than the veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. The horses, so essential to Napoleonic warfare, were especially hard to replace. And this time, the enemies gathering against him were more determined, better organized, and more numerous than any previous coalition. Prussia, which had been humiliated at Jena and subordinated to French power since 1807, rose in a national uprising of remarkable passion. The Prussian reformers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had used the years since Jena to completely transform their army, introducing conscription, promoting officers on merit, and creating a more flexible fighting force. When Prussia declared war on France in March 1813, it did so with genuine popular enthusiasm. The language of nationalism, of the fatherland, of liberation, of the German people rising against foreign domination, was deployed to motivate soldiers and civilians alike. It was the same language the French Revolution had used to motivate the armies of France. Now it was being turned against France. Through the spring and summer of 1813, Napoleon fought a series of campaigns in Germany with remarkable skill, winning several battles despite his disadvantages. But in October, at Leipzig, he faced an enormous Allied army composed of Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and Swedish forces, what the Germans would call the Battle of the Nations. For 3 days, this battle of the Napoleonic Wars raged around the city. Napoleon was outnumbered nearly 2-1. When a bridge was prematurely blown up, trapping much of his rear guard, the defeat became a catastrophe. The French retreated across the Rhine with perhaps half that army they had brought to Leipzig. The following year, 1814, saw the Allies invade itself for the first time. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several battles with forces that were a fraction of his opponents, moving rapidly and striking at isolated parts of the Allied advance. For a brief moment, it seemed he might yet stave off defeat, but the Allies were too many, too determined, and too well coordinated. Paris fell in March 1842. Napoleon's marshals, exhausted and sensing the end, refused to continue the fight. On 6 April, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. The Allies treated him with remarkable generosity, or as his enemies would later argue, with remarkable foolishness. He was given sovereignty over the small island of Elba, off the Tuscan coast, with a court, a small army, and a pension. It was exile, but comfortable exile. The Bourbon monarchy was restored to France in the person of Louis XVI, brother of the executed Louis XVI. Europe gathered in Vienna for a grand congress to redraw the map of the continent after 25 years of revolutionary upheaval. Napoleon watched from Elba. He was not yet 45 years old. He received reports from the mainland suggesting that the restored Bourbon monarchy was deeply unpopular, that the new regime was undoing revolutionary gains, returning emigrated nobles to their estates and alienating the soldiers and administrators who had served the empire. In February 1815, Napoleon made a decision that was either magnificent audacity or reckless folly, depending on one's perspective. He escaped from Elba with about 1,000 soldiers and landed in southern France. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary episodes in modern history. Instead of raising the alarm and arresting the fugitive, the French soldiers sent to stop him came over to his side. Regiment after regiment. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVI to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, embraced his old commander and brought his entire corps to join him. Napoleon marched north, and as he went, France rallied to him. He entered Paris in triumph on the 20th of March 1815, while Louis XVI fled into exile. The episode took 20 days. Napoleon had retaken France without firing a single shot. The powers gathered in Vienna immediately declared him outlaw and prepared for war. Napoleon, he had only a limited time before the full weight of European coalition power descended on him. His strategy was to strike before the Allies could concentrate, to defeat the British and Prussian forces in Belgium before the Austrians and Russians could arrive. In June 1815, he crossed into Belgium with his refurbished army. The Waterloo Campaign of 1815 was fought over 3 days of extraordinary intensity. On the 16th of June, Napoleon fought a double battle, at Ligny against the Prussians and at Quatre Bras against the British. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny, sending them retreating northward, but Marshal Ney failed to deliver a decisive blow at Quatre Bras against Wellington. On the 18th of June, Napoleon attacked Wellington's army, which had taken up a strong defensive position on a ridge south of the village of Waterloo. The battle raged for most of the day. Wave after wave of French infantry attacked the British line. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's most elite troops, who had never been broken in battle, were committed in the late afternoon. And then, at the critical moment, the Prussian army, which Napoleon had believed was retreating in the opposite direction, appeared on his eastern flank. It had not retreated. Under the determined leadership of the old Prussian Field Marshal Blücher, it had marched through the night to reach the battlefield. The appearance of the Prussians transformed the situation. The Imperial Guard broke for the first time in its history. The French army collapsed into rout. Napoleon fled. He surrendered to the British and requested asylum in England. The British, who had no intention of letting him anywhere near Europe again, sent him to St. Helena, a tiny, remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from the nearest continent. He lived there for 6 years, dictating his memoirs and carefully crafting the legend of himself that the world would remember. He died in May 1821, most likely of stomach cancer, though the debate continues. He was 51 years old. Part EX, the Congress of Vienna, and the New Europe, 1T8 reconstructing the old order. While Napoleon plotted on Elba and later on St. Helena, the great powers of Europe were meeting in Vienna to decide what the post-Napoleonic world would look like. The Congress of Vienna was one of the most important diplomatic gatherings in history. A gathering of kings, emperors, foreign ministers, and their elaborate retinues that lasted from September 1814 to June 1815, and that set the basic structure of European politics for the next century. The Congress was dominated by 4 great powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain. The Austrian foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich, was the most influential figure, a brilliant, cynical diplomat who believed passionately that the revolutionary ideas unleashed by France in 789 were the greatest threat to European stability, and who dedicated his career to suppressing them. Metternich's worldview. a conservative vision of legitimate monarchical authority, balance of power, and the suppression of nationalism and liberalism, gave the Congress its philosophical framework. The statesmen at Vienna were guided by several principles: legitimacy, the idea that rulers who had been displaced by Napoleon should be restored to their thrones; compensation, the idea that the great powers that had contributed to Napoleon's defeat should be rewarded with territory; and balance of power, the idea that no single state should be so strong as to dominate all the others, as France had done during the Napoleonic period. In practice, this meant a wholesale redrawing of the European map. France was reduced to its 17792 borders, losing the territories it had conquered during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The Austrian Netherlands was merged with the Dutch Netherlands to create the Kingdom of the Netherlands. A new Germanic confederation replaced the dissolved Holy Roman Empire. Prussia gained significant territories in the Rhineland and in Saxony. Russia retained most of the former Duchy of Warsaw. Reorganized as the Kingdom of Poland under the Tsar, Britain received strategic territories including Malta, the Cape of Good Hope, and Ceylon, consolidating its global commercial empire. The Vienna settlement also created a new system for managing European international relations. The Concert of Europe, sometimes called the Congress system. The great powers agreed to meet periodically to discuss threats to European stability and to coordinate their responses. It was the first systematic attempt, collective European security. It worked imperfectly, but it worked. The decades after 1915 were, by the standards of the preceding quarter century, remarkably peaceful. There was no general European war for 40 years. What the Congress of Vienna explicitly refused to do was accommodate the new forces that the French Revolution had unleashed: nationalism and liberalism. The delegates in Vienna saw both as threats to the established order. Nationalism, the idea that people sharing a common language, culture, and history constituted a nation that deserved its own state, was particularly dangerous because it implied the dissolution of the multi-ethnic empires that dominated Central and Eastern Europe. Liberalism, the idea that individuals possessed rights that governments were bound to respect, that constitutions were necessary to limit arbitrary power, was nearly as threatening. Suppression of these forces was ultimately. The ideas of Sessenhun in 89 could not be unthought. A generation of young Europeans had grown up knowing that revolution was possible, that old regimes could be overthrown, that new political orders could be built. The revolutions of 1830 and 1948, the springtime of peoples, would demonstrate the forces unleashed by the French Revolution had merely been contained, not extinguished. The world that the Congress of Vienna tried to restore was already gone. Parte X, legacies and echoes, one ain't and find ain't beyond, how the Revolution changed the world. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars left a world transformed. The changes were so deep, so far-reaching, and so lasting that it is almost impossible to overstate their significance. To understand the modern world, its politics, its legal systems, its ideas of rights and citizenship, its patterns of war and diplomacy, one must understand what happened in France between 1789 and 1815. Most immediate and tangible legacies were institutional. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of equality before the law, property rights, and civil liberties, became the basis of legal systems not only in France but across much of Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Asia and Africa. It is still in force, in modified form, in Louisiana, Quebec, and dozens of other jurisdictions. The administrative and educational reforms Napoleon introduced, the prefectural system, the lycées, the École Polytechnique, and other grand corps created a modern state apparatus that outlasted the empire by centuries. The metric system, adopted during the Revolution, gradually spread across the world over the following 2 centuries, becoming the universal standard of scientific measurement, and eventually the everyday system of most of the world's nations. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became a touchstone document for radical movements around the world, directly inspiring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Perhaps the most powerful and consequential legacy of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period was the spread of nationalism. Napoleonics, wherever they marched, carried with them both the example of French national self-assertion and the resentment that military occupation always generates. In Germany, the humiliations of the Napoleonic period sparked a nationalist awakening that would eventually, after the upheavals of 1848 and the wars of German unification, produce the German Empire in 1871. In Italy, the Napoleonic reorganization of the peninsula planted the seeds of the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian unification that would culminate in the creation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. In Spain and Portugal, the chaos of the Peninsular War destabilized colonial authority in Latin America, helping to launch the independence movements that would create the nations of the modern Americas. Across the world, the French Revolution and its consequences accelerated the processes by which the political map of the modern world took shape. The Revolution also profoundly changed the nature of warfare. The La Ville Messe, the mobilization of an entire nation for war, with conscripts motivated by patriotism and ideology rather than mere professional obligation, transformed armies from relatively small, expensive, carefully preserved instruments into enormous forces capable of inflicting casualties on an unprecedented scale. Napoleon refined and extended this transformation, using mass armies with unprecedented mobility and flexibility. The wars of the 20th century, with their total mobilization of national resources, their industrial-scale killing, their blurring of the line between soldier and civilian, are, in a terrible sense, the inheritors of the military revolution that began on the plains of France in 792. The French Revolution also changed how people thought about political change itself. Before 789, most people, even those who were deeply dissatisfied with their rulers, could scarcely imagine the fundamental transformation of the political order. After 1789, revolution was a real possibility, a demonstrated fact. The knowledge that the established order could be overthrown, that new political forms could be created, that ordinary people could seize the levers of power, this knowledge could not be erased. It would inspire reformers and revolutionaries for the next 2 centuries, from the radical Democrats of 1848 to the social revolutionaries of 1917 and beyond. And yet the French Revolution also taught a darker lesson: that revolutions are extraordinarily difficult to control, that the energies they release can easily turn destructive, that the pursuit of absolute virtue can lead to the guillotine. The Terror remained a haunting example of what revolutionary politics could become when fear, ideology, and the logic of emergency converged. Conservative thinkers, beginning with Edmund Burke, whose reflections on the revolution in France appeared in 1790, the year after the revolution began, argued that the attempt to rebuild society from abstract principles was inherently dangerous, that the accumulated wisdom embedded in existing institutions was more reliable than the theories of philosophers. Napoleon's own legacy is perhaps the most complex and contested of all. Was he the heir of the revolution, the man who carried its principles across Europe, abolished feudalism, spread the code, and demonstrated that merit rather than birth could determine a man's fate? Or was he its betrayer, the military dictator who crowned himself emperor, who sacrificed millions of lives for his personal ambition, who left France smaller and weaker than he had found it? The debate has never been resolved, and perhaps never can be, because both things are substantially true. What is certain is that the world Napoleon left behind was different from the world he had found. The political geography of Europe had been remade. The legal and administrative structures of much of the continent had been reformed. The idea that rulers owed their power to the consent of the governed, or at least could not indefinitely ignore the governed, had been permanently installed in European political consciousness. The age of absolute monarchy, whatever its survivals and revivals, was fundamentally over, standing at the end of this extraordinary quarter century of upheaval. It is worth pausing to contemplate the sheer scale of what had happened. In 25 years, France had passed from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy to republic to terror to directory to consulate to empire and back again, via a series of constitutions, coups, and popular uprisings. It had fought virtually every major power-up, singly and in coalition. It had, at its height, controlled or dominated a continuous territory from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, and in the end, it had been pushed back, exhausted and diminished, to something close to its pre-revolutionary borders. Yet even in this apparent return to origins, France was not the same country that had gathered around Louis XVI in 1789. Its society was more egalitarian, its legal system more rational, its administrative structure more modern. Its people had a new and powerful identity as citizens rather than subjects. And its ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, the rights of man, the sovereignty of the people, had crossed every border, survived every defeat, and lodged themselves permanently in the political imagination of humanity. The French Revolution was not a single event, but a process, a turbulent, violent, creative process, which an old world died and a new one was born. The birth was painful, bloody, and deeply uncertain, but the world that emerged from it is recognizably the world we still inhabit. A world of nation-states and citizens, of constitutional governments and human rights, of professional armies and industrial warfare, of ideological conflict, and the permanent possibility of revolution. To understand how we arrived here, we must understand what happened in France between the year 789, when a king summoned his people's representatives to help him solve a financial crisis, and the year 1815, when an exiled emperor dictated his memoirs on a remote island in the South Atlantic. Certain? Correctly. History would not forget him. The age of revolution had passed, but the world it made endures. Closing narration: in the end, revolutions are not made abstract forces. They are made by people, by the fishwives who marched to Versailles in the rain, by the lawyers who swore oaths in a tennis court, by the soldiers who followed a young Corsican general across the Alps and into history. They are unmade by people too, by the committees that sent their comrades to the guillotine, by the emperor who could not stop conquering until there was nothing left to conquer, by the diplomats in Vienna who tried, and largely failed, to put the genie back in the bottle. What the French Revolution demonstrated, with unforgettable force, is that the political order is not fixed. It is not natural. It is not eternal. It is made by human beings, and it can be remade by human beings. That discovery, simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, is the enduring legacy of 1789. The old world is gone, a new world has taken its the inheritors of the rights and ideas and institutions that emerged from those years of fire and blood are still living in it.